Funding and logistics have delayed plans to eradicate Libya's chemical agents, as well as its chemical weapons production facility. Now, Libya was to have destroyed all 23 metric tons of mustard gas by the end of 2010, according to the Hague-based Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. But 9.5 metric tons remain. The OPCW says Libya was granted an extension until May to destroy the rest. Joining me to talk about this a little bit more is Patty Culhane, our White House correspondent. How much of a worry is this now that chemical weapons clearly still remain in the country?
Well, you know, I put that question personally to Jay Carney, the White House press spokesman, and he said, I have nothing for you on that. I don't know if he just didn't want to talk about it publicly. I know officials here are concerned about it. Now, they like to say, listen, we think we destroyed all of the bombs because it obviously has to be dispersed. And the officials in The Hague tell me that the chemicals are being kept, they think, about 600 miles south of Tripoli. They don't think they're in any danger. White House officials tell me, though, in an official statement, that it's always, of course, even the possibility that they could slip into the wrong hands. They are doing their best to maintain security on those chemical weapons. Because, as you mentioned, they've got more than 9 metric tons of actual usable mustard gas. The question is, can they find any sort of vehicle to be able to disperse it if they chose to use it? And that is the big question right now.
Potentially a horrifying situation, isn't it?
Horrific.
So obviously, big concern here in Washington. Barack Obama has been rather slow to come to the foreground, but he's made some quite outspoken statements. He's also going to be meeting with Nicolas Sarkozy. What do you think is going to come out of that?
He's going to be talking with Prime Minister Cameron and Nicolas Sarkozy, and they're going to be talking about what next steps that the UN can take. And as you know, the UN is going to be meeting tomorrow, the Security Council. The Obama administration has been very careful to say, we're not going to do this alone. We want to talk with an international voice. Now, yesterday, what we heard from the president is all options are on the table, but right now I'm just going to basically talk about the talk. I'm going to send Secretary Clinton to Geneva on Monday. They were really pushed on that here in the White House, and the question was, people in Libya are dying, and you're going to wait until Monday? And they pushed back on that. They said, we're not necessarily going to wait. We have a sense of urgency. We want to see immediate action. The most important thing that came out of the briefing today is that they said no options are off the table, and they were asked, even military, they said no options are off the table.
So intriguing to know what that is. Just slightly away from this, but talking about public interest, you know, I've been watching a lot of the US networks, the news networks, and I was quite amazed that obviously Libya leads all the output, but not much focus on it.
No.
Sometimes a couple of hits and then off on other stories. Do you think the US is bored about this or not interested? Or,
you know, it's been striking the difference between Egypt and the coverage. It seemed as if Americans were glued to their televisions for Egypt. We haven't seen that much out of Libya, and that could be because as we were having trouble getting the real story out of Libya, that makes it difficult not to have the pictures. I think one of the most interesting things is we did hear the president talk about Libya today. You know, he waited obviously several days since it started. We hadn't seen him until yesterday. Today he was talking about the economy, and he addressed Libya, but the question he addressed is what it would mean for gas prices. That seems to be what Americans are hearing about, at least in the media. What is this going to do? And the talk has been, we've heard from economists, $5 a gallon of gas could totally ruin the economic recovery. And so that is where all the focus has been. The president today came out and said, I think we can ride this out. I don't think it's going to spike like that, basically. But obviously that shows you where the White House's concern is, at least
it could
today.
be disastrous for him. That's it.
For the domestic recovery, everybody will tell you if he wants to be reelected, he's got to get this economy moving. Nothing will throw the brakes on an economic recovery like a $5 gallon of gas. We've seen it in the U.S. before. That is their biggest concern.
Thanks for that, Patty. Now, Patty did mention about this UN meeting that's been called for Friday. The U.S. is calling for the expulsion of Libya. There's going to be a special session for the first time to discuss a member, and if we can get some sort of background information, some insider information about what is likely to happen. I'm going to be talking to Khan Ross. He's a former British diplomat at the UN, talking to him live in New York. He's now the executive director of the non-profit diplomatic advisory group Independent Diplomat. Thank you very much for joining us. What do you think is likely to happen on Friday?
Well, I think the most likely thing is that there'll be a UN Security Council meeting, which will issue some kind of pretty firm statement about the need for the end of violence. Whether it will agree measures like asset freezes, referral to the International Criminal Court, things like that, much tougher, more substantive measures against the Libyan regime, remains to be seen. Diplomats in New York are discussing this informally amongst each other at the moment, testing out ideas on each other, seeing what the market will bear. Of course, the Europeans and perhaps the Americans will be pushing for firmer measures, but pushing back are likely to be countries like China and Russia, with their well-known resistance against the so-called interference in internal affairs.
I mean, do you think they are stalling, and do you think the US has been stalling? The US said it would be very outspoken on the UN Security Council, and apparently what I'm hearing is that they took a bit of a back seat and didn't get too involved. It seems that every country is reluctant to take some kind of concrete action. Why is that?
I agree. I think the UN Security Council and its member states have been very slow to react. We didn't see any kind of meeting on the Libya situation until Tuesday, several days after the violence began. And that meeting produced a very weak statement, a press statement, which is the lowest in the hierarchy of the forms of expression the Council can take. So it's been very slow to react. And whether it will react more substantively tomorrow remains to be seen. There are options like asset freezes, travel bans, referral to the ICC. We certainly won't be seeing things like any endorsement of military intervention or the declaration of no-fly zones. There'll be strong resistance.
What is it about a no-fly zone? Sorry, this keeps getting raised and it keeps getting quashed. What is the issue there? Is it the fact that once you say let's have a no-fly zone, then you are committed? Then the UN possibly has to send in peacekeepers, for example?
Well, that's off the table. I don't think anybody's thinking about that at the moment. The reason no-fly zones is an issue because of these very disturbing reports of military aircraft being used to attack protesters inside Libya. The reason it's a problem here at the UN is because the UN has very rarely actually itself mandated no-fly zones. It's only happened once in the case of Bosnia. The Security Council did not mandate the no-fly zones in Iraq, even though the US and UK claimed UN authority for those interventions. The biggest problem with no-fly zones is who would enforce them? Who has the will to send their own aircraft to enforce this, to actually involve themselves in a military situation inside Libya? And would such an intervention actually be helpful, or would it play into the hands of Gaddafi in claiming dishonestly at the moment that there is foreign hands behind the uprising?
Con Ross, good to have you talking to us live from New York. So obviously all eyes now on the UN human rights meeting on Friday. The US is calling for the expulsion of Libya. We'll certainly be bringing you that live and updated throughout the day on Friday. Back to you, Stephen, in London.
Thanks very much, Jane. It's the rumour mill that is causing a lot of changes in terms of oil prices. Traders said oil prices fell more than $2 a barrel late on Thursday after rumours circulated that Gaddafi had been shot. There's no immediate indication of where that rumour had originated or any news report to substantiate it. But earlier in the day, prices had climbed to record levels. So joining us from the New York Stock Exchange is gas and oil trader Ray Carboni. Oil prices, Ray, were rising. We heard this morning, falling later in the day. Uncertainty may have caused the rise. What caused the fall?
As you mentioned, uncertainty as to the whereabouts and the health of Mr. Gaddafi certainly could affect pricing in the short term.